So yeah, as Yali says, I'm Chris. I'm the founder and CEO of FirstbaseHQ.com. And as he touched upon, we help companies set up, support, and scale remote teams globally. And I think that's probably the best place to start. So what we're gonna talk about is developing what I would phrase as a remote work manifesto. And what that really means is how can we develop a scalable way in which we can operate as a remote first organization. There's a lot of conversation today about hybrid organization, remote first, office first. What we're going to specifically focus on is remote first organizations. And how I would define that is not just where people work, but from the perspective of the mindset that they have of doing work. And the easiest way to sort of give you an example of that is to use a metaphor, which is everyone's been in a meeting where there's some people dialed in and there's 7 to 10 people in a meeting room. And it's a really bad experience for everyone involved. It ends up in this situation where the remote workers are basically second-class citizens in the meeting. And the alternative would be a remote first mechanism for working, where if one person dials in, everyone dials in. So what we're really talking about is the processes by which you become a remote organization. And to sort of just extend that a little bit further, why I suspect it's interesting to hear from me, although I manage a company that is specifically focused on kitting out remote workers, I would say there's a caveat that the data and information I'm sharing is potentially biased towards that. We've spoken to something like 2,000 companies over the last 12 months or so. There's a lot of different types of organizations across those 2,000 companies. But if they're talking to me, by definition, they would be more remote. So I think it's always worth starting out from that perspective to just recognize that and obviously share it. The second thing, which I love to share, is the reason why I became a remote worker in the first place. And this is Millie. This is my daughter. I was working in an office like the vast majority of people a few years ago when she was born, and what happened was I basically missed her walking, laughing, and talking for the first time. So as I founded my first business, which is a financial technology company, I decided I had to be remote for many reasons, but mostly it was a quality of life thing. I want to be there to see Millie grow up. I want to spend more time with my partner. I want to live where I wanted to live. And yeah, a whole host of other things, but remote work for me became incredibly important. Then fast forward a couple of years, the world changes. COVID obviously accelerates that trend by 10 or 15 years overnight. So what we're going to touch on first before we sort of get on to the manifesto part, which I'll share in the last couple of slides, is really the rationale behind why you need to do this, and why this is such an important decision for companies going forward. So the first part is we've spoken to, as I say, a large number of companies. What we're hearing is almost all of them are going to get rid of their offices to a greater or lesser extent. And almost all of them are going to let people work from home 2 to 4 days a week. The cut of the office is going to vary from anywhere between 40 to 70%. And the implication of that is that they just don't have enough space for people to work on in the office. And that means that people will work from home 2 to 4 days a week, and then come into an office or physical location 1 to 2 days a week. So in terms of that leading to the manifesto part, the first part is companies just have to decide how much time in person they are going to have and how much is necessary. And that's going to vary massively depending on the specific functions inside the organizations, depending on the types of work that you do. But ultimately, it's something that an organization needs to be super purposeful about in order to make that transition successfully. The second thing that we hear is a huge number of companies actually going fully distributed. So getting rid of the office entirely, going fully distributed, and everyone working remotely all of the time. And I think what potentially why some companies have done that is that as the pandemic's persisted and certain habits and behaviors have calcified, people have realized they may not necessarily want to live in an expensive city anymore. So what's happened is they've left the city. They no longer live close enough to commute every day. And this, again, is a decision that organizations are going to have to take. There was a report by Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago which focused on the volume of people that are going to are intending to leave their organizations if they're forced back to the office. And that statistic was 40% of workers overall and 50% in millennials. So again, this is something that companies need to get right in order to not just attract great talent, but also retain great talent as well. Access to talent, I think, is the most important thing that I hear regularly from companies as to why going remote first is both appealing, but also necessary. So the biggest transition that happens from a company perspective is that they change from being able to hire the best person that they can afford in a 30-mile radius of an office to being able to hire potentially the best person on the planet that they can afford for every single role. So the implication of that is not only are you just fishing in a local talent pool of maybe tens to hundreds of thousands of people that are capable of doing the job, you can actually expand that massively, theoretically increasing the average talent level of the organization when you do that. The second part is around cutting costs. And this obviously has a massive implication on organizations as they no longer have to pay for commercial real estate costs. That $20,000 figure is fairly indicative. That varies massively depending on where your office is located. It can be as low as $10,000 a year per worker, or it can be as high as $50,000 per year per worker if you're in somewhere like San Francisco. And if you're a 1,000-person company, that saving is somewhere between $10 and $50 million a year, which you can obviously use to pay people more, to hire better talent, to increase the average talent level inside the organization or talent density. And there's a whole host of other ways that can be repurposed as well. So I think it's super important to recognize that this isn't just about accessing great people. It's also potentially about becoming a more cost-efficient organization. So that's all great. And I think what's also worth touching on is some of the challenges that companies face. Remote burnout is something that we hear from a lot of companies. Prior to the pandemic, the big concern was, how can we trust our people to do great work remotely? And I find that very amusing at this point. I think that is no longer the concern by any stretch of the imagination. I think companies are now very comfortable that people will do great work. And the bigger question is, how can we actually help them have that divide between work and living? And I think part of the answer as well, what we're living through is pandemic remote work. It's not the same as normal remote work where you can work in different locations, you can travel, you're not homeschooling, there's not lockdowns. So a large part of this, I think, is answered by the unlocking as things do start to normalize. But I think it's certainly wise to be cognizant of the fact this is potentially a large issue. Something else companies want to think about, whether they go remote first in a hybrid manner or fully distributed, is we're still going to see people physically. So just because a company is remote doesn't mean that you never see your team. Actually, I think the big question companies have is, we know that we do still want to get together because we want to maintain and in many respects increase the quality of communication and collaboration that's happening. And we can do that even if we come together far less frequently than every day in an office. But I think what companies are starting to think about is, how can we do that in ways that are really appealing to workers? And remote on-sites is one thing that they're talking about. So flying people into potentially exotic locations and spending a week where the entire purpose of that is to communicate, collaborate, spend time with your teammates, and become a more cohesive and collaborative community inside the company that you work for. This is somewhat anecdotal, but I think it's something that's coming out in the data that we're seeing published. All the smartest people I know personally are planning to work remotely at least some part of this next decade, and all the most exciting companies I know personally all plan to hire remotely this decade. And that ties to the data. That figure says 90%. It's actually pushed out towards 95% of people who never want to work in an office again full time. Over 60% of people want to work remotely at least 3 or 4 days a week. And the thing that statistic doesn't really elaborate on is where they want to spend the rest of that time. The media perception is that people may want to go back to an office. I think when you dig in with people, that isn't the case. They don't want to work from home 5 days a week. They may want to work from home 3 or 4 days a week, but they want to spend that 1 or 2 days a week in a third space, which isn't necessarily an office, because the commute is such a bad experience that they want to avoid. Something else that companies really need to get right is what type of organization they're going to be and what the communication is going to be like inside the company. So I spend a lot of time as a founder inside my own business talking about asynchronous working versus synchronous working. And what that really means is, how as an organization can we leverage and maximize the benefits of remote working rather than just trying to see what happens. And I think that's the biggest trend that we're seeing. It's really easy for companies to just replicate the office remotely. It's somewhat more difficult to actually just take that, to work asynchronously, to trust people to do deep focused work without distractions, and empower them to do the best work that they've ever done in their lives. And that's really what remote work should achieve. Everyone's worked in an office where they're sitting there, someone walks over, taps them on the shoulder, and it then takes them 30 to 40 minutes to get back into the flow of what they were doing previously. And remote work, it really tries to avoid that. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't times that you do come together and work synchronously with your teammates, because clearly you do. But I think the best way to do that is to work asynchronously. And as I say, really empower people to do the best work that they've ever done in their lives. Personal injury is obviously something that's incredibly important to me. And it's something actually that I think companies weren't aware of at the start of the pandemic, and probably workers as well. I think a lot of people take it for granted with respect to the equipment that they're provided with in an office, and the implication and impact of those things have on preventing things like back pain, neck pain, and repetitive strain injuries. So what we're seeing companies do now is look to provision their workers with the right equipment to do great work, where they're as safe, comfortable, and productive at home as they would be in an office. And for us, we work with everything from early stage startups that I'm sure most of you are aware of, through to $50 billion publicly listed companies whose apps and services you probably have on the home screen of your phones. So this is something that I think wasn't obvious. It's now becoming more obvious, and as remote work continues to persist, it just becomes more and more important that organizations are looking after their people and making sure they have the right tools and equipment to do their jobs. And that, I think, is sort of what I just touched upon. This is something where it's not just specific types of companies that are struggling with. This is a universal problem where it doesn't matter the size of the organization. Every company is dealing with the same thing. We work with early stage companies. We work with publicly listed tech companies. We speak to some of the biggest organizations on the planet. And I think what's really surprising to me, actually, in retrospect, is that they're all facing the same challenges. That's not typically true of anything, where large companies have different problems to medium-sized companies, have different problems to small companies. The reality here is that because this has been something where a global pandemic has been the catalyst to thrust upon 15 years of change in the space of 15 months, everyone's had to react and adapt and try and make the best of the situation. So in terms of being a universal problem, I think companies are trying to formulate solutions in the same way, which is obviously a big challenge for them. The next thing I think companies are beginning to think about is remote work as a green revolution. And I think that feeds into the overall manifesto part as well. What type of organization do we want to be? What type of carbon footprint do we want to have in the world? And in many respects, I think remote work is probably the biggest green revolution in history that the fewest people are talking about. And I think there's a lot more to go into this. Clearly, there's cutting the commute. There's not having offices running for 24 hours a day. But I think we're just at the start of that process. And companies are certainly cognizant of the fact that, yeah, this is something that's going to be impactful as we start to go down the line and people actually really care about it. I alluded to this for myself personally at the front of this, but I think everyone's got their own stories here. I get DMs from people probably on a daily basis where they share their why of remote or what remote enabled them to do. And quality of life is really the most important part. For me, it was seeing my daughter walk. Not seeing my daughter walk, laugh, and talk for the first time. Last week, it was a woman who reached out to me and said, Hey, Chris, I had this situation and remote was really impactful. Her sister had cancer. Ultimately, she went to her company and requested to work remotely during that period. Her sister had 2 kids, and ultimately the woman's sister had passed away. And that's a really difficult thing. And her message to me was, yeah, it was incredibly difficult, but remote work enabled me to be there for her sister during that period, for her kids after it. And in many respects, it helped her grieve by being able to be there. So in terms of quality of life, I really see it as a switch in many respects. People love to talk about the future of work. I'm not really that interested in the future of work. What I really care about is the future of living. And how can we empower people to have the highest quality of life possible so they don't have to live in expensive cities and have low disposable income while moving away from family and friends in pursuit of opportunity. And I think that's an integral part of why remote work is so important going forward. Remote pressure is something we're beginning to see companies think about. I like to talk about it as a remote work dilemma, which basically posits that any organization that is less remote than their biggest competitor will get crushed by them. And that's for all the reasons that we've touched on previously. If you're less remote than your biggest competitor and 95% of people want to work remotely, at least part-time, where do you think your most talented people are going to go? So what we're going to see happen, and this sort of touches on the next slide, is companies are going to go remote. They're going to be forced to go more remote, and then they're going to have to almost become fully remote in a very short period of time based on what other people in the market are doing. We've already seen this play out in some of the trillion-dollar tech companies who announced their intentions to go back to the office full-time. Allegedly, there was an uproar from the engineers inside those companies who basically said, well, you may go back to the office, but we are going to go remote. And we're going to see this play out time and time again. Something else which companies begin or are concerned about is the fear of remote. And I think what we're realizing after 15 months of habits and behaviors calcifying is they're not scared. They're no longer scared about the quality of work that will be produced. What they're scared about are intangible things that they can't measure or don't fully understand. So we hear a lot of people talk about quality of communication, collaboration in person, water cooler chat. And I think part of the issue with this is that actually there's a lot of issues here which are just excuses. Water cooler chat's probably a good one. Everyone says, well, we solve a lot of problems there. And to me, the question then is, if you're solving all your problems by mistake, do you think that's a good thing, or is that a particularly bad thing that has a potential to derail the business? On the quality of communication part, I'd say I'm willing to concede that quality of communication is potentially better in person. But then my question to whoever says that would be, how much better? It's not 50% better. It's not 20% better. Maybe it's 10% better, but that then depends on how many times you've met someone physically, and that probably reduces somewhere down to around 1% if you know that person very well. And I seen, sorry, a question come in the Q&A, and I think this is probably a good place to address that. Is we start to see a lot of questions about, well, what about young people who are living in shared apartments in cities? What about people in terms of loneliness? What about the psychological challenges of working remotely? I think many of those things are actually induced by the fact that this is pandemic remote work, as I touched on before. Loneliness is a product of lockdowns and not being able to see friends and family. Actually, remote work can be far more social than working in an office. I personally take issue with the fact that some people believe we should get our closest social contact in an office. Personally, I think I should be the one that chooses who I spend most time with, not my employer's HR team. And I really want to spend more time with my family. I want to live where I want, which lets me live closer to my friends. And I think a lot of those things which are touched upon and are often viewed as issues of remote work are actually implications of the high cost of living in cities and having to be close enough to commute daily. So do young people live in shared apartments because they want to, or do they do that because they have to live in a city and get to an office every day? I don't know, but that's I guess the way that I think about that. Something that companies need to get comfortable with is transitioning from measuring how much time someone sits in an office chair to how much work is actually being produced. So in terms of an organizational manifesto point, I would say output over time. We need to measure how much work they do, how much work they produce, the quality of the work they produce, over did you sit in that seat for 8 hours and I don't really understand anything else that you did. Something, and this is what I would view as the superpower of remote teams, is the transition from verbal culture to written culture. Now, I'm sure everyone's got examples who's here today of times that something in an office is communicated person to person, peer to peer, and that knowledge in the organization only stays there as long as the people who know it reside within the business. So the transition that happens in remote companies is a move to documentation, where everything that happens and any questions that people have once are then recorded. And this becomes a repository of knowledge that people can add to over time. So not only do organizations become more intelligent over time, that knowledge stays there irrespective of the people who have created that knowledge, even being in the business anymore. Flattened organizations, I think, is something that companies should have as a goal. I'm not necessarily sure that I think it happens. But what I would say is what organizations have realized during the pandemic is that middle management serves little tangible purpose in the old method of command and control. And the challenge there is that they're the ones typically making the decisions on how teams work. And that is what has led to what is, I think, widely referred to as Zoom fatigue today. And the problem with that is that by replicating the office environment remotely and just going back-to-back meetings because a middle manager wants to feel productive, that's in direct contrast to the actual people who do the work getting work done. So what's got to happen is there's got to be less middle managers who are bottlenecks to basically just shuffling the progress through to their managers. And we need to become better at understanding how much work is actually being produced. And I think one way to do that is to cut management out the picture and just be far more purposeful about how we do measure progress and what actions people are doing on a day-to-day basis. This is one I particularly enjoy, and it sort of touches on the Onsites thing that I discussed earlier, but it takes it a step further. some of the biggest companies on the planet are discussing creating resorts focused on facilitating the best in-person work experience imaginable. And what they're really looking at is creating resorts where people fly into once a month, once a quarter, less, more frequently, depending on if they need to. There's hoteling on site. There's everything that those companies need. And I think the question here, to relate it back to the manifesto, is how far do we want to go as an organization to try and maximize the benefits here? And I think this is an interesting way to think about it. And I think something that we will see some of the trillion-dollar companies of the world probably moving towards, in order to have more control over the things that happen when they are working remotely. This is something that we're beginning to see emerge in a few European countries in particular. We've seen a lot of talk about this in Ireland. We've seen Germany begin to act. We've even seen some states in the US begin to suggest that the opportunity to work remotely should be offered to workers. And I think this happens incredibly quickly, where the laws get implemented and companies have to react. But this is really, again, about giving workers choice. I'm going to get onto some stuff nearer in the last couple of slides, which take this a step further and sort of elaborate on why I think this is so essential. But ultimately, I think this is something that companies are going to have to deal with on an increasing basis going forward. Meeting death, again, we kind of touched on this, so I'm going to skip over this one, actually. And then we're on to, the last couple of slides before we go on to the manifesto part. There's a lot of talk inside organizations about culture. And I think culture is actually totally false. I'm not sure culture is a thing. What I think people are actually talking about when they refer to culture is community. And I think what we need to understand is community is a thing that is super transient. It evolves and grows and changes through the passage of time with the coming and going of people from that organization. And this is even more important inside remote organizations, where the perception is that culture is harder, which I'm willing to entertain, even if I don't think it's a thing. And I would agree that community is definitely harder. That said, I think there's a lot of false bravado about what the office actually achieves. People like to think that the office is great for social time, but I would argue that it leads to shallow, superficial relationships that lack depth, breadth, or meaning. And the offices have almost become these adult kids club type places where people find it incredibly difficult to do deep work. And I think the answer in many respects is remote work. And what we see, certainly as a team and some of my friends building some of the biggest remote organizations in the world, they begin to see their teams have deeper, more meaningful relationships when they see each other less. It's not a situation where they go into the office on a Tuesday and say, hey, did you see that TV show last night? And it's just this inane conversation that never leads to anything. And the difference with remote organizations who do come together once a month, once a quarter, or whatever cadence they set, is they're coming together with the purpose of building those bonds. They're not coming together to just do work. And I think in many respects, offices have become a great place to pad out an 8-hour day. And what that means is we speak to our colleagues, but we never go below skin level. And I'm sure there's a lot of people would push back on that, and obviously willing to hear that. I'm talking about my own experience and not going to speak for anyone else. But I always question, like, how many people do you speak to from the last company that you left? What about the company before that? What about, I don't know, the company before that, if you've had 3 or 4 jobs after graduation or having come into the workplace? And there's a decreasing number of people that you stay in contact with. And my point here would be that I'm not necessarily sure our deepest relationships or our closest social contact happening in an office where, if that company goes out of business, we no longer have those relationships, it is a good thing. So that's more of a question than anything else. And And the final piece before we go on to what our manifesto is as a company and some of the underlying principles of that is the diversity and inclusion piece. So for me, this is the most important part, and this is the thing that isn't guaranteed. And it's, I think, the thing I would love to leave you thinking about when I finish is remote organizations should become the most diverse, inclusive, and accessible organizations in history. It shouldn't matter. The offices are great for certain people, terrible for other people. It shouldn't matter if you're a single parent, you're caring for someone else, you've got a health condition or an impairment that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to work in an office. Remote teams should be universal. Access to opportunity should be universal. And I think there's few things as important to remote work as helping to ensure that that happens. But I think, as I say, it's not guaranteed. So we need to take that forward. We need to make sure that that actually does happen. Otherwise, I think potentially there's a situation where we end up in a worse place than we are today. There's a lot of data coming out about women falling out of the workplace during the pandemic. This is tragic. We need to have organizations where people can obviously work and contribute and access opportunity. And I think this is part of the rationale as to why the opportunity and option to work remotely will become law in many places as a result. So to finish, I'm going to touch on the four sort of tenets of what our manifesto is, just to leave you thinking about what you would make yours. We start with 4 points. Number one is trust over surveillance culture. Trust your people to do great work, and they typically will. I always get the question, or I did get the question prior to the pandemic. Well, Chris, how do you trust your people to work remotely? My question to them was like, you employ people you don't trust? Trust should be intrinsic. So I think that's the first part. Control your life over living to work, I think is an important part. From a remote perspective, we transition from a situation where you have to sacrifice your life for work to being able to work around living. And that seems like a subtle thing, but actually I think it's super important. And it's something that workers obviously gravitate towards. Flexibility of time over set schedules, super important if you're going to be accessible and you're going to be able to attract a diverse range of people. I want to be able to drop my daughter at school. I want to be able to travel more. I want to live closer to my family. And a need for me to do that is the ability to not be stuck in an office from 9 to 5. If a team member of mine does their best work at 5 in the morning till 11 in the morning, why do I want to stop them doing that? All I care about is them producing great work. And we should really empower people to do that. And the final part is about autonomy. How can we empower people with the autonomy they need to do great work without processes getting in the way? And the final part is the principles around that. So I'm not going to touch on that. I realize we're probably at the 30-minute mark now, and there's some Q&A to go through. But I would say, for me, the question is why those 4 parts always tied back to the principles that we sought to propagate as an organization. And yeah, thanks.